On the morning of the 18th day, I was in New London Hall with my writers. I was reviewing different write-ups announcing the beginning of our new automation program. Needed to put it in a way that emphasized the power we would be granted by it, and not that which we were giving to the morality of lukewarm steel. Luckily, one of the Americans was a whiz with that sort of thing. Winfield, his name was, a travelling salesman type. With him, the machines were less violations of God's will, and more our marvellous, miraculous, metal-mind mates, always on the job, no rest for their plates. Plates meaning feet, by the way. Thinking all Brits spoke Cockney was a common folly of the new arrivals, actually, which ended up being embarrassing for everyone, but undoubtedly endearing. On the topic of new arrivals, that afternoon was when the Winterhome survivors made it to us at last. 4 days of walking with their luggage on their backs. Their one sled was piled up with 6 corpses. Actually, we found a better way to eat, thank you. The new London they arrived in seemed to unnerve them. Winterhome had failed because its leader had pushed the people too far. When they worked out that I had a brewing rebellion of my own here, they despaired. Good. Another group to voice for unity at all costs. Plus, they were about to learn how much worse things could have been. And to say that to the surviving 20 from a city of 1,000 is not at all overplaying it in this case. Our scouts had reached Tesla City, and the messages were flooding in by the ream. The city lights they had seen before were not from the buildings, for in fact the whole place was surrounded by steel walls made of dreadnought hull. The lights came from above it, where the old boy Tesla had rigged up some miracle of science. It was a great, invisible canopy of pure energy. Six said it was a force field, one of Tesla's specialities. Ash and snow alike produced twinkling flashes when they reached it and were spirited away to the sides into large drifts beyond the city walls. Six was alive with hope, stating that such a device must have made radiography impossible, which was why we hadn't detected their presence. He was technically right, but we'd have got silence from them either way. The scouts reported that part of the city wall was collapsed, and inside the streets were veiled in smoky clouds. Darkened outlines of bodies could be made out nearby. A huge tower in the middle of the city was intermittently flashing out bolts of electrical energy, apparently at random. The scouts saw a building torn apart by an impact, yet most of the buildings still stood. This dark turn had happened only recently. The smoke in the streets was, thus, what remained of Tesla City's population, trapped there, for the force field kept the air in the city quite still. Winfield was going to have to work hard on this one. More pressing was the question of whether our scouts should venture further in. The city was being destroyed before their eyes. If the ruinous tower was not stopped there and now, the whole endeavour would have been in vain. And we needed Tesla City, dead or alive, for the defectors had spoke of huge warehouses filled with steam cores, the engines of our survival. That is why I ordered the scouts to dash for the tower and locate its controls. At least one of them made it. We knew this even before the next message clacked out, for the radiograph signal was extremely strong. It was transmitted from the city's long-range array on the tower. It said, "Electric backfire burns." No punctuation, no elaboration. Not that it was required. The subsequent radio silence was all we needed to hear. I was away to the writer's room at once. Sadness could become vindication. Their loss could become our gain. Merely a matter of words. Winfield was aghast at the news when I told it to him straight. Then I told him to imagine how he would have wanted me to phrase it and tell everyone else in such a manner. He gave me the most empty laugh and leant on the windowsill as if hanging on for dear life. From his side I could see people running towards the other side of town below. Suddenly a deep droning cry echoed around the crater. It was the birth rattle of an automaton, climbing onto its plates outside our construction yard. It looked shaky at first, but its metal mind learned to balance within a few minutes. We were building our betters indeed. This was the truest sign of that golden age I waxed lyrical about. The automaton helped us erect a new steam compressor and house the Winterhome bunch within a few hours. Seeing this, people were a little uppity actually, for they were petitioning me to reduce their working hours. They wanted the machines to take their jobs. As I mentioned before, these folk weren't exactly workers in their mindset. Clearly I had to tell them no. We'll relax when we're dead. Such proverbs of old New London remained as true as ever. I came up with the novel idea to present the situation as a competition of sorts, the humans against the machines. To work fewer hours was to give the machines an advantage, show them what a man with a soul is really worth, etc. Merely a matter of words. With man and machine firing on all cylinders, metaphorically and literally respectively, we had momentum like never before. The new bunkhouses weren't just livable, they were outright hot. We had more coal than we knew what to do with, so we had stoves crackling away on top of the steam radiators. You could sleep all night in just an overshirt, and you didn't even have to cover your mouth with a handkerchief, for the freezing wind above the crater drew the fumes far away as soon as they appeared. There were some living far worse in England last summer. But idiocy cannot be simply thawed out. Some of my fellow New Londoners were up in the small hours writing slanderous messages on the walls, propaganda for the death march south. When the watchman found it, I ordered it be removed before dawn. Seems I was falling prey to a trap. The squad who went to carry out the duty were jumped by a gang of Londoners, twice their number at least. This was something else. I had tolerated their treachery when it was, if you'll excuse me for saying it, merely a matter of words. I had been shown up for being too soft, the reverse of Kumasi. The injured would see justice espoused in the next bulletin from the hall, and everyone else would see the new order in person. From now on, our police and militiamen were to patrol the streets at all hours. By now I had the manpower at my disposal to have eyes on every corner, and apparently such measures were required. And I had worried the dirty great towers were going too far. New London was on lockdown, or was further secured, as we eventually put it to everyone. I also enacted new city law that required everyone to assemble at the heat tower for a briefing each morning. This served two purposes. One was to allow me to give everyone a few words prepared in the hall to focus them for the day ahead. The other was for the guards to whip round and see who wasn't there, for dissenters were almost certainly Londoners also. There have always been many potential uses for a list of names, from ancient Rome to New London. We knew one of their names for sure in the meantime, Jack Everard, the voice of London. He was out there again that evening, shouting about how untrustworthy I was, the whole operation was, and how it didn't matter if they didn't know how they were to get to London, only that they indulged their pride by trying. I'm sure some people were convinced by this nonsense. One man wasn't. He emerged from the medical tent nearby, his arms wrapped in bandages. It was Blacknell. Since the death of his wife, he'd been helping Painsworth treat the new arrivals, but an accident with some boiling water had him out of action for a while. Wise or not, he stumbled out into the crowd, and with a barking voice that had not been used in a long time, he challenged Jack to a fight. Upon request, he clarified that he wanted the man to shut his mouth before he got more people killed. Coats were cast off, and 2 lengths of steel were birthed from the audience. "It's old brass like Blacknell here that got us into this mess," Jack claimed. "Following orders until the end. The actual bones and blood end, isn't it? He doesn't even ask what they're hiding from us. He lives when his master says, and now his master says die, don't he? Sorry, old boy, but you'll have to follow through here as well, won't you? Your wife did after all." The swooshing and clanging of their poles began, and was at once made inaudible beneath the growls and caws of the crowd. That was just as I was arriving. It was over by the time I pushed to the front to get a look. Blacknell had apparently landed a clean forehand into Jack's stomach, tumbling him over backwards. Then he simply hadn't got up. Amid the calls for further fighting, someone went over and poked at him. Blood suddenly streamed from under his left leg. The bugger had a shiv hidden under his sleeve and had managed to stab himself in the back of the thigh while trying to break his fall. He'd already lost too much blood by the time we actually worked all that out. He died before we got him a stretcher. Main artery. Most military men had heard of such underwhelming wounds causing sudden death, and now they'd seen it. Blacknell tossed his bar aside and trudged off without comment. It was a duel, after all, so none could fault him with any weight. I had to go back to the hall and get something written up about it. Not about the duel, really. Lead Londoners' deadly dishonour. That sort of thing. The important truths, and the most important fictions. I should add here that many people were well aware of the selective reporting the hall was engaging in. One fellow in particular was often coming into the lobby and demanding to speak to me about it all. Not even sure what his name was. He died around then. Our first suicide. Almost proves my point, doesn't it? He was hanging on to the whole truth, and it killed him from the inside. He believed the Royal Society doom and gloom. He used to post his musings on the mess hall board until the guards had a chat with him. I remember one verse he set out there. In the thickening twilight they cry, new dawn. The light and dark are mixed to grey. Stay down or know the end, he warns. Pupils grow, the last great day. Yes, quite right. Not your problem anymore now, is it? Enough of that. It was the Golden Age. The Golden Age. A fresh team had made it to Tesla City. The place was still standing, now coated in an ashen veneer. It was time to bring everything they had to us, in accordance with my promises to the people. The first sleds ferried our dead, but those of the city were not as important as the steam cores. On a related note, Six had been working with the experts to improve our steam compressors. We were running at 2/3 power and getting more than enough pressure for the whole city. The continuing warmth had emptied Croaking Painsworth's tents. Steady as she goes then. Or, in better words, a golden age. We could deal with more, and just as well. There were 70 fresh mouths inbound soon, from east and west. One group was a rowdy bunch of survivors from Tesla City. They were drunk when our scouts found them, and they nearly shot my men to pieces. They had a cadaver in their effects, stowed in a cave. It was Nikola Tesla. Had he been too hard and pushed his men to violence, or too soft and let the situation get out of hand? Whichever it was, he picked the wrong one. I ordered them to bury the man there outside the cave. Had to do something for the poor sod. We parasites were growing fat from his bounty after all. His crew were sobered up by the freezing march back to us here. The other inbound group was an inexplicably alive class of children from Winterhome. Their teachers had apparently got them out early, with supplies and fuel, and stowed them away in a nook at the foot of a nearby mountain before things got bad. I had a team searching for old Winterhome gear who stumbled upon them by blind chance. Kids thought it was their teachers finally coming back for them. I think the adults had gone to scavenge in Winterhome, and that was the last heard of them. Hadn't rounded up the bodies there either, so hard to add anything more to the case file. The scouts reported that they were bringing the kids back to New London, without orders, as it happens. Well, would I have ordered those useless mouths be left to die instead? My crew apparently thought not. I hope they were right about that. It was going to be hard for the little legs. That was around the time of the 21st morning, when the winds changed and the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a few hours, then stayed that way. Averaging -60 now, for those keeping track. Our new thermometer on the beacon could only go down to -65. Better start building a new one then. Our sweltering homes were suddenly refreshingly cool, as I ordered people put it. Better start building new ones then. Could only manage 10 degrees even beside the iron forge with the radiators on full power. Better start cleaning the infirmary beds then. God took our hard-earned comforts and promised to do so again if we dared retrieve them. That was his nature, pure and simple. I'm wrong here. Even more pure and simple is to shout, "The night is darkest before the dawn," and close our eyes. Pupils grow, the last great day. A golden day, though. No trace of doubt to be found about that. 6 reported to the hall, saying he'd finished laying out all the cables. I helped him wire them up to a mouthpiece in the cupboard adjoining the writer's room. Needed somewhere cramped so one's voice wouldn't echo as they spoke into the new thing. We had the mouthpiece bolted to a wall, above a little stand for the scripts, and in front of a tall stool, and above a couple of heat bars. Closed the door, and the outside world, the real world, seemed very far away. Yet it was from in this chamber that the real world was to be moulded into the fantasy of our writers. Huge megaphones had been attached to posts around the city. With 6's wiring, I could speak through all of them at once from New London Hall. It was as if it was the voice of New London itself, showering praise on the parasites that rode it. Further to my newsletters, I could now inform people of every mote of progress we made, and remind them without halt that such progress was not the product of fate or the gifts of the Almighty, but of their own hard work, and their adherence to the city's will, to the plan. I had appointed foremen to most of the key work sites, picked from the best and brightest. They would ensure my disembodied chants were heard and acted upon, in exchange for as much as they cared to eat every day. The foremen, that is, not the masses. And they really were masses. My original crew were now a minority. Dummers, Atties, Babs, Yanks and mates. Not just Londoners, not just Brits, not just humans. My palette grew messier by the day. The mates, the automatons, were the fastest growing of these demographics. We had 5 up and running by the end of the 22nd day. They were doing so much of the legwork that we had a glut of idle thumbs. How could the devil resist us now? While some people used their newfound freedom to look after the children, others got to work preparing to leave. Yes, still preparing to leave, even with free food provided by my administration, even to those not required by it. In London, you were the free food. The guards locked down the streets. The lost food was found scattered about the ground here and there. The thieves cut and run. Only one was caught red-handed. It was bloody Hodge, the automaton transcoder. You'd think a Cambridge man would know better. Left his family behind, apparently, as if that was our misdeed to be punished for. Locked him up in the hall. Kids from his classes in the lab painted a load of tosh on the wall outside. Sorry, kids, everyone, but I really am taking away your freedom. No one is free to die in New London. We are alive. Had to get to reminding people that the next morning. Pretty sure all the drama made the Londoners think twice, which was 2 times more than they would have otherwise. They were on the verge of reason, tempted to step forwards, afraid to turn back. All I needed to do was push. I visited the nightly rally of Londoners that evening. Perhaps 100 people there, but hard to know how many were serious. The usual drivel was spouted, diluted by the rising tide of reality. I offered a rebuttal. The crowd let me take the stand. I'd already won. They were willing to listen, and to hear the voice of New London in person made its truths inescapable. The automata were stepping over us to drink from the heat tower. It was -60 above us, but I could scarcely bear my vest that close to the generator. We had everything we needed. Everyone we needed. Everyone who was left. This was it, I told them. Was it perfect? Couldn't convince them of that. Would life get better if they stayed? Maybe. Would it get worse if they left? For them, certainly. What argument was left? What argument could spurn my rule in favour of the cruelty of God and his nature? There was none. I thought the movement was dead when I finished. No applause, but no retorts either. Minds were changing before my eyes. Again, the Yanks were praising me for my rhetoric and tolerance. As they did, I was punished for it. There were those who were beyond reason, like Hodge. The last Londoners made their move that night. They raided the mess hall, and when Ross there tried to resist, they killed him. Beat him to death. It wasn't quick or easy. Ross could have run, but he was a firm part of New London. The time it took for those maniacs to kill him was long enough for the alarm to be raised and the hall to be surrounded. Had 20 men, a few rifles, and no patience. No fight this time. The gang of 9 Londoners was dragged out into the street and placed on their knees before me. People were gathering all around, throwing curses and more at the thieves. Then Ross was pronounced dead. Now the guards had to hold the crowds back. The masses were crying out for revenge, blood for blood. But in death, those monsters could never admit they were wrong, and others would always suspect they were onto something. So, I took a look along the line in front of me. All of them were mine, at ease that is. Picked out one who wouldn't be missed, and had him brought over to the crater-side lift. I gave him some of the food he had tried to steal, a coat, and pushed him onto the platform. The crowd was quiet now. I pulled the lever and sent the man to London. 2,000 miles at least. The pulleys and gears jangled to life as the steam core rumbled. All looked at the pale, ghastly face of the man achieving his dream. The platform took him away, then returned without him. I told the crowd that all those who had wronged New London would be welcome to go to London at any time, but should they wish to remain, the comforts of a cell were still on the table. The lift remained empty, and the perpetrators were thrown in with Hodge while the engineers built a lock-up down the street. Now the Londoner movement was dead, whereas we were alive. I've ruminated on those dullards so long that I've given the real New Londoners too little credit in these pages. Our scouts had brought back all manner of things, from Tesla City, from the wrecks of the 2 American dreadnoughts along the coast, and from a couple of old Royal Society depots in the mountains. The Yanks had shown our people the way to their secret spot out there, a section of the coast dotted with hot springs. The waters remained unfrozen. A bit of life, a lot of food. Fish was a welcome change from the elks and bears that prowled our neck of the increasingly proverbial woods. Everything hauled in had our storehouses overflowing. The 25th day was a warm one. This was the point where -40 began to be considered warm. With so many people freed of labour by our machine mates, we turned the day into something of a city-wide project of renovation. Walls were doubled in thickness. Our homes received extra rooms, basements, radiators, and even new furniture. Ambitious folk added an extra story to their houses. We worked too hard. We attracted too much attention. The next day it was -70 out there, a new low. Handily counterbalanced any improvements we'd made, and those buildings that hadn't been seen to yet were now lucky to break 10 degrees near the radiators. Pipes in the pub froze over. No more moonshine on tap. Only warm place in New London Hall was the speaker's booth. From there I announced that it was time for us to show God what we were made of. I had all the engineers on the heat tower, with tools clanking and welding fires roaring. The Yanks might have beat 6 when it came to automata, but our man was the foremost steam scientist in London. If he wasn't the best in the world before, he certainly was now. With help from all the automata, we had the entire tower lifted a few meters off the ground, and then added a new huge steam compressor beneath the generator. Everything was piped in while the thing was still burning red hot, and once the valves were unlocked, the tower shuddered into a new lease of life. Steam pressure was up by 1/3, and the residents of the new houses rushed to turn down their radiators as the heat surged. I had a medal made and presented to 6. The voice of New London sang his praises into the night. Everyone was singing along. This hero of the city had not only kept us alive, but brought us closer together. In literal terms also, for all the work far out from the compressors was now done by the machines, while we huddled ever closer to the heat tower. Still alive, sorry to say, my lord. Hodge got frostbite in his cell, but aside from that, Painsworth was in among the idlers, whiling away the hours telling kids not to touch the burning radiators with bare hands. The poor idiot was treated soon enough, and while he was sat in the infirmary with a hand in a bowl of water, I paid him a visit. He descended into tears when he saw me. His refrain about his family came through the snivelling, though it was hard to make out. Well, I was the man for the job on that particular topic. Told him that family was personal. Personal didn't matter if New London, the last of the Lamplight, was at stake. Family can be remade, humanity cannot. While it was by no means as simple as that, no more complex a model was useful to us in that crater. There's the good truth and the bad truth, but on the edge of death, all fiction is good, so it's the safer bet. Hodge was freed that night. He was my man now. He was to work on the automata and listen, both to me, or the voice of New London, and to the masses. He was to do what I told him and tell me what must be done to ensure unity. Perhaps too clever a man to have as a stooge, no offence to Ollie or Chalk intended here, but clever men see trouble coming early. Yes, that's certainly true, although it wasn't Hodge who proved that true in the end, as I'll tell you later. That same night we had something of a festival. We gathered around the heat tower as close as we could bear and celebrated the end of London and the rise of New London. The conspiracy against all of us was over, and we were alive. We ate and listened to a boy play guitar over the megaphones. When the wind roared above, we roared back and drank. I didn't need to say or write anything about it. It was New London, the prophecy fulfilling itself. Finally, I knew I was right. Things didn't get strange again for a good 24 hours. Then, at dawn on the 28th day, a host appeared on the crater's edge. They were equipped like us, Royal Society chosen. They were dying, suffice to say, and didn't have much to say to us until we had them fed and bedded. Many of their group, most of their group, were dead already. That's what it was like outside New London, after all. Once they finally got around to talking, they confirmed what I suspected, and then provided a nasty surprise. These people were from the eastern coast, from a town called Ironcliff, another site claimed for mining opportunities by the Royal Society the previous year. Now they were here, and they weren't going to be the last. That wasn't the nasty surprise though. The eastern coast was more populous than our west coast resort, and even had cities ran by the Scandinavians. They had been running a few weeks more than us, and shared leaders between the towns. Their captains worked under Royal Society minders. I think Connaught was meant to be mine. These Englishmen from 100 miles away were sounding like an exotic foreign civilization. Anyway, the point I'm gunning for is that these many towns, cities and stations, heat towers, homes and all, had been abandoned. All of them were coming here. They didn't know about the sun dimming, but they knew about something more immediate. They said that the eastern seaboard was being destroyed as we spoke. They were hysterical about it, so it was hard to get any solid facts on the matter. Asking made it worse. I eventually gathered that the thing they called doom over and over again was less metaphysical than implied. It was something to do with the weather. Oh, having trouble with that, are you? That was my first thought. I'm glad they didn't tell me the whole truth right away. Otherwise I might have joined in their hysteria. At that time, then, I simply reassured them that New London was a place of warmth and order, and agreed to look for the rest of the people marching our way. There were hundreds of them out there. the remnants of the thousands who had lived in the domain beset by doom. They were bringing children, hunger, no gear or materials, and worst of all, the truth. God had pulled one over me. This sun-dimming affair wasn't how he was going to kill us at all. Doom was far closer to home, and now made its approach at the backs of the screaming crowds, coming to beg me for salvation, to pray to me, perhaps. So be it, I thought. Let them descend into my God-forsaken realm and cower. There's warmth in hell yet. To say the city of New London had become noisy was an understatement. The towers rasped out work orders, and my speeches were being played on loops through the speakers around town. We switched them off at night, of course, but night was even louder around then. We had just been told the good news that lots of people were still alive out there. Their cities had been destroyed and their numbers halved every day, but you know what we do with details like that among the living. Their approach warranted the use of our stored lumber and steel to build rows of new houses. While our people tried to sleep, the mates, 10 of them in all now, were carpenter, welder and scaffold alike, drawing buildings up from piles of materials like a stage illusion. They were, as my speeches reminded everyone, winning the contest of man against machine by a long distance. Their secret? They simply did what they were told. Don't let them be the only ones who survive all this, I urged people. We flesh and blood creatures had some tricks yet. Six was working day and night on building airships for transportation and hunting. He wasn't battling the machines, but the Yanks, and was pulling out all the stops on what British science could achieve. Yanks would have the last laugh, though, as one of them was watching his experiments through the darkness of the small hours. That was about the time we had the first big group arrive from the East Coast, 70 of them. Snapped up our new builds, thanking God for their salvation, despite me standing right there giving them free houses. Imagine if the Duke of Connaught had seen this. Imagine if God had seen this. From them I learned more about the actual problem they were running from. Not just bad weather, but extreme weather. They had only evacuated in time because some government wind catcher from Norway had gone around preaching doom in the streets. They didn't have any papers to prove matters, but their unanimous word was that those they left behind must be dead. Was probably true whether they were lying or not. Such were things outside our city, I repeated at the morning assembly. We were fine. Tesla's steam cores drove our mining drills deep into the ground, filling our coal stores. And as for food, well, in the daylight later on there was this low-pitched buzzing sound, terribly loud, that echoed all around the city. From the roof of the hall I could see the mates lined up along the edge of the crater, stooped over dark piles of rubber. Said piles were shifting about and rising up of their own accord. Quickly we realized that they were Barlow balloons, fashioned in the manner Six had been experimenting with. Yanks had met Six's sleepless enthusiasm with sheer numbers and ambition. They had been constructing a fleet of small airships, little cutters, in secret. Six had solved for them some final issues for handling the balloon, and now those balloons were rising up, pulling the craft out from under ash-laden sheets and up towards the crater's lip. Long steel tethers stopped them from escaping. I said we were fine now for food, and these were why. Over the course of the day, the gung-ho Wellington boys and some of Tesla's survivors learned to whiz them around over the city, and then that night they ventured out into the world. They could float up over the strongest winds, transport hunting crews to new locations, and use radiographs to coordinate with them from above for unrivaled vision. The pale sheets of snow, ice and ash almost glowed under moonlight, so little could avoid the all-seeing aerial eyes for long. Only we could have built such marvels. Only in New London. I went up in one to hover over the city and look out at the world. Hadn't seen it for weeks. It was a sight to behold. Our lands. Winterhome and Tesla City were smudges to my right and left, and ahead the smooth plains running up to the interior, upon which the dark speckles of the refugees were visible. And above, the soft glow of an August winter sky. What a fantastical way to see the end times that was. We had scouts go out to pick the new arrivals up. We had another large group come in around midnight the day after the last one. These guys contained a few disciples of Nansen, this Norwegian storm seer. He had apparently been the one to convince people over in Norway to go to Greenland. He had been involved in earlier Royal Society antics, and knew quite well we British were going to hole up here with all the coal. Apparently he was advocating that they leave almost as soon as they arrived, and here they were, with the Brits dragged along for the ride. Like the first group, they attested that the unbelievers were dead. Again, no proof, but for the lethargy in their eyes as they spoke. We needed more houses, and we were starting to run out of space. This crater had originally been designated as a refuge for 250 people. We had double that, and the last 100 or so we'd taken in were bedridden with hypothermia or had frostbitten limbs on the chopping block. 2 died in Painsworth's care on day 30. She blamed the mates. You see, we had no other doctors to match her, so Hodge came up with a way to have the automata administer heat baths and the like to take the load off. I gave him the okay, and then there we were with 2 dead from shock as boiling water met frozen skin. That was how the automatons learned not to do it again, Hodges told me. Painsworth was in tears in the hall, but I didn't let her kick the mates out. If people will die without them, the risk of dying with them isn't worth scoffing at. That was the New London way, after all. Since it's not written anywhere else, I'll add here that several more people died that day. There were more lessons to learn, I suppose. Well, Painsworth would get her way in the end. A few doctors showed up that night, among another horde of Easterners. The doctors were there to keep the dying in the group alive, and by Blighty did they have their share of dying. Behind them was the spectre of death itself, on the hunt. The morning light revealed its corporeal form. From a cutter, moored above the city, one of their group showed me something through a monocular. There it was. To the north and west, a huge arc of the horizon was writhing as if the earth had come alive. It was a hurricane of unworldly strength. In appearance it was a churning wall of grey, as the wind had been given some substance by all the ash it had harvested. From time to time you would see streaks of yellow or green or brown. This monster had travelled far and eaten much. Inside, the newcomers claimed, was air and matter that had not seen the sun in weeks. Whatever the storm passed over had its heat evaporated away into the winter moor, and its material gouged from the earth, darkening and cooling the inner currents of the beast even further. That was what had destroyed these people's cities. This was doom. It could freeze time itself, they mused, and so no remedy existed for its onslaught. Nansen was dead, but his warning to us had made it. The storm was following a curved path, extinguishing the east coast, coming to a halt over the interior, and then slowly accelerating again to the southwest, into my world. The acceleration should have already begun, I was told, as I looked out at the edge of life beyond the mountains. Then they asked me what I was going to do about it. It was too late to pretend it wasn't there. People had been slowly gathering the truth from the new ones over the last few days. I could pretend it wasn't really coming to us, but then it would kill us. I would be no better than a Londoner. We could run, but then God would see us die in the open and get the entertainment he sought. So what were we to do? For that day I simply gathered up all the scientists from all the different groups and tasked them with putting together a report on our prospects. Scout teams went out to find the rest of the refugees who were encamped all over the plains and out of supplies. The mates and our people kept building houses and piping up radiators, but for one mate who was getting the graves dug. Bunch of refugees gave up the ghost once their families were safely in our hands. How I wished to feel whatever bliss tipped them over the edge there. We worked in good old, thriving, growing New London for one more day. Weather was foul. The storm had sucked any sprouting of summer away. -70 in the afternoon. But all was in good order and spirits were high. Friendly welcomes for the Easterners, and plenty of heads craning up as our scientists were bobbing around in the cutters, refitting the beacon with new instrumentation as well as a brighter lamp. Between nearly 100 boffins, they'd managed to get a read on the storm by evening. Wasn't too happy with that. They brought their findings into the hall and stood in a huddle before me like naughty schoolchildren. Told them to get on with the bad news. The storm was coming. 300 miles across, 10 miles tall, an inescapable snare of 200-mile-an-hour winds carrying an arsenal of reeling debris. This was no hurricane. This was the atmospheric aftershock of the Yellowstone eruption, a megastorm that no living thing could tolerate. According to some spectrographic test and so on, it was -100 without wind chill, just on the edges of it. And it was coming. We had about a week before it hit us, and even before then the Frostlands were going to be purged of life. No more scavenging Tesla City, no more hunting, no more world, really. But New London wasn't the world, was it? That all the eye could see was doomed meant nothing for us, did it? Did it? Well, it comes down to the numbers. The report stated that it would take about a week for the thing to pass over us, so we would need that much food at least. Then, beyond the storm, if we were somehow alive, the world wouldn't be. So in truth, we'd need enough food to last forever, or until we finally killed ourselves in some other fashion. A tall order, but an order nonetheless. I made the arrangements. Our cutters would gather up anything and everything we could use. We'd dig pits and cover them in steel canopies to store dried meat and coal. We'd cover every hair-thin seam in our walls and recycle generator smoke to thaw the water tanks. We'd sew the clothes from the dead into blankets, melt their jewels into heating elements, and weave their hair into draft-proofing. And the living only got off slightly lighter. There were moans, and there were those who had to be shown a rifle to get them to hand over their finery for smelting, but it happened soon enough. No one was happy about all this, but they wanted to do something about the situation as much as I. It was more than wanting to survive the storm. Pretty much everyone was weighed down by so much regret and sorrow that living was beyond what they thought they deserved. But everyone wanted New London to survive the storm. How do I know that? We could have run away. We had the cutters. We had the means to make a full-blown airship or a land dreadnought if we wished. We could outrun the storm, get around it, and then be free to die in a place of our own choosing, I suppose. But who was asking for that? The new folk, maybe, but they were in no state to go anywhere, so that only made it more laughable. Leaving New London, entering the doomed world? Who would think such a thing? No New Londoner. No one who wanted to be and remain alive. Not a single one. So, the city endured. We dragged the rest of the Easterners in from the plains, corpses and all. We worked all day, all night. The young and old, the novices and the masters, the ill-fated and the heroes. We had all decided that we were indeed New London, and since New London could not die, neither could we. It was as simple as that. It was as true as that. I had a safe made, hidden in the basement of the hall. Somewhere to put these pages, just in case. The storm crept closer. It was slow, walking pace, a Goliath that gave you the pleasure of living just a little bit longer in its shadow. And like the Spartans of old, we laughed at that shadow and readied our shields. One got away. A girl, taken by fear, had run off, abandoning her father, abandoning all of us. Probably the result of letting Six and Company teach them. Their convictions were understated or downright faulty. The father came to me, asking for a compression sled and a pile of food to go find her. Recognized the man. He was an Atty, helped me dig graves in the early days. Requisitioned the gear personally to keep it all quiet. What can I say? If I'd been told that my family was somehow alive out there again, I'd have left too. To be weak is our final reward. We had no shortages of sleds, at least. Our scouts had found a handful of camps out there and brought in various eastern travelling parties. The dead were more useful to us than the living, sorry to say, but being alive is the only requirement for citizenship, ultimately. After a few of these groups had come in, scouts came across something a little different. Perhaps 10 miles from us was a rather sophisticated camp, with working snowcats, plastered with Royal Society markings. They were grizzled scientists from the interior, fleeing the storm. They'd heard of Nansen, but not his warning. Their genius minds had told them to avoid the cyclone of their own accord. Message said they claimed Nansen was alive and based over near Tesla City. Gave us a rough map. Traded it for a map to New London. Sounded like these folk could do more for us than donate hair. Good to know that some of the original base crews had made it. Too bad these folk hadn't been tapped into the radiograph network, or they would have known that Nansen had left our neck of the woods weeks ago. Scouts followed their map, and found first an abandoned outpost with some of Nansen's personal effects, and then a few hours' walk west they came upon his lab, almost buried. No signs of fighting, coal still ready to burn, doors and windows sealed up such that you couldn't hear the wind outside. This was the real deal. Not a soul there, but Nansen had predicted our arrival as surely as he predicted our doom. The notes he left filled in some of the gaps. That facility had all manner of scopes and graphing equipment, and was where he had discovered the path of the megastorm. He'd gone off to investigate further, and presumably that is why he was later said to have been making a panicked tour of the eastern bases, where everyone claimed he stayed voluntarily. Given the effect he must have had on morale, I wonder if the folk there took necessary measures with him, then realized he was bloody right. Might explain why they fled without any gear prepared. Anyway, among his research notes we did get our hands on something interesting. He had a theory about what the storm would leave behind. The storm was reducing the air pressure around it as it sucked on the atmosphere. This was causing global wind patterns to change. He thought that it would draw air from all over towards the general vicinity of the storm, and by virtue of a long-winded bout of mathematics, he stated that high-pressure air was trapped in pockets behind the storm. It had in its entourage little pieces of the climate it had picked up on its journey across Eurasia. Southern air. Warm air. In other words, if you could stomach it, the grass was greener, or less white, on the other side. Plus, the way it scoured the air of ash shortened the effect of the volcanic winter substantially. Nansen claimed that actual winter would be warmer than it is now. He made no mention of the sun. Both our local observatory and a similar facility in Tesla City had proof of the dimming, yet he said nothing of it, despite being close enough to both to see them when the wind was still. So there I had a golden ticket in my hands, calculations that proved there was reason to live on, but calculations that did not factor in the dimming. That's to say nothing of the electromagnetic field fluctuations that Tesla's own hand had written of. It's funny actually, Tesla had stressed that the dimming wasn't enough to explain the local temperature. Nansen had worried that his instruments were off, for the effect of the eruption and the storm couldn't explain it alone either. Here I stand then, on the shoulders of giants as they say, able to proudly announce to the Royal Society that we're all going to die for a fascinating variety of reasons. Still, it was something. If certain people were wrong, and certain people were right, there was an end to this ordeal. Therefore, it wasn't entirely false to promise my people salvation. They deserved such a promise for all their hard work. We had doubled our fleet of cutters, and almost everyone was either battening down hatches, out on the hunt, or shoveling coal from the top of the mines into our new storehouses. A small group were tasked with gradually turning all our frozen meat into jerky. We were on track, with a good few days of food locked up in a steel depot near the icy crater edge. But not everyone was living for New London, it seems. I had a visit in the hall from Effia. She was a true New Londoner. She informed me of corruption in the ranks. I had a few more ears and eyes check it out, and she was right. The kitchen hands were smuggling food back to their houses. They seemed to believe they were worthy of more rations than others. They were lucky we needed experienced cooks right then. Couldn't imprison them without jeopardizing the preparations, so I had them under a sort of kitchen arrest instead, with militia guarding the doors and inspecting everything going in and out. We still didn't get the numbers to quite add up, but at least people saw that New London was taking everyone's well-being equally seriously. I gave Effia a care package to hide in her bunk as a reward. By the end of the 34th day, we had about a week's surplus locked away. More hunters and more cooks were still being trained. New London does not relax for the bare minimum. Even had mates looking after the steam ovens so we could cook through the nights. Even in the face of that, some louts, inspired by the bloody nannies, the Easterners that is, were bullying people out of their share of drink and making a fool of themselves in the streets, screaming about our impending deaths. Had to rough them up and bar them from the bar. People seemed to take offence as my boys did this, but I had the explanation ready to present at morning assembly. To say that we're going to die is to ignore the fact that New London cannot die, and that we are New London. So how could such drivel be seen as anything less than treachery? I left them in one piece, didn't I? In the army, the penalty would have been far harsher, as many of them knew. We ended the assembly with our cry, "We are alive," and off we went for another day of busy preparations. The storm was at the walls of Tesla City, long abandoned by our salvagers. The coastline was gone. The craggy terrain simply gave way to that greyish malaise. It looked deeper now that it was close. The colourful streaks were clearer to see. Sand from the Gobi Desert, earth from the steppe, ash cleaned from the mountains of Scandinavia. And now, somewhere in there were pieces of Tesla's force field tower and the remains of his employees. The walls of the city were still upright as they disappeared from view. Some of our scouts were still out there, rummaging through various Royal Society labs we'd found the coordinates of. Seems the Brits were about to go down the electromagnetic line of reasoning like Tesla, but said notes were just musings found beside corpses. Couldn't bring anything back from their last redoubt in a cave, for the scouts needed their sleds nice and light. Frontier of the Storm was already pelting the snow around them with stones, and they barely made it away in time. It wouldn't be on our doorstep for 3 days, but the Frostlands was already lost to us. All scouts were recalled. Had to do some triangulation with the radiograph signals to get them all in, for the fringe of the foggy maelstrom was concealing the beacon light. They told me they saw all manner of other things fleeing with them. Things we would normally hunt, bears, elks, birds, but now they shared purpose with our boys. Had the traps around the city tripled to catch us a last haul as life passed on by. With the storm that close, daylight was fading fast. It had a funny effect on people, that. New London was still fine, better than ever, but when they saw the sky change, they felt that things were beyond our control. Case in point, my writers in the hall had nothing for me. They didn't want to work. They wanted to sit around a burner and pray for our salvation. Pray to God, that is. The same God who was responsible for the state of the outside world. I let them do it. And when they were done whispering with closed eyes, I pointed out that the sky was yet darker. Wrote the next bulletin myself, told everyone to keep their eyes bloody open and their bodies working. God had no power in New London, but we did, obviously. By the 37th day we had more than 2 weeks of coal and food ready, and everyone left alive in the Frostlands was crowded around the heat tower at roll call. Could be everyone left alive in the world, for all we knew. After all, the storm had been on quite a journey already, and only folk like us, prepared for the frost already, had any recourse against it. But we didn't talk about the world. Look up and it was plain to see. There was no world anymore. The darkness continued to fall, temperature falling by the hour, about -80 that morning. 2 days until the spinning edge of the storm breached the crater. It was so close you could hear it. The ground was vibrating, reacting to the gales smashing into the mountains out west. It was enough to drive folk mad, and indeed it did. They wanted to steal themselves away in their homes. They wanted their walls, already doubled, to be tripled or more. They didn't want to hear or see it, especially the nannies who had regressed into a state of mania similar to that they arrived in. Not everyone was like that. Wellington boys, most of whom I had in my own guards company at that point, tried to calm people down, but there was no reasoning with them. The mob was threatening to storm the depots and get to hoarding if I didn't give them wood for building and burning. Was more concerned about its potential for weapon crafting at that moment. On the other hand, what else were we to do? If panicked final measures would save us, then let panic take hold. We didn't have any good way to get the materials we would need to give everyone an equal share that was actually enough to be useful. And everyone was going to get an equal share, I was clear about that. With all the fallen trees in the crater long since cleared away, and with the frostlands gone, we had to bloody mine wood from the glacier. You could see trees in the ice. Mates pulled up mining drills and laid them on their sides, and then everyone was cordoned off as blades drove into the ice. Once the shrapnel had settled, bits and pieces of wood were torn out like precious stones. We had everything we needed down here, and the drilling, while agonizingly loud and slow, was proof of that. The image of splintering ice was one that filled the hearts of New Londoners with pride. It took another day or so, but they had their ration of emergency timber to use as they saw fit. I knew some of it would simply be sharpened, but the guards knew too. I'd been discussing such matters with the watch leaders in the hall. There was every chance that push was going to come to shove, and that New Londoner might turn on New Londoner. It was down to the militia to keep the peace, to keep New London going. They were all true New Londoners, these lot, as passionate about the city as anyone. They knew my reasoning. Well, not precisely, as it turned out, but we'll get to that. We had one more day to get through. Everything was quiet. Everyone was quiet. Who was thinking that we should have fled? Perhaps everyone but me. But they were quiet. The guards did their rounds. The kids were wrapped up until they were twice their real size. The mates stepped over us without a clue. Some 650 people were crammed into our little ring of civilization. Walk 20 meters out to the crater's edge, and the cold would take your feet in mere minutes, and your life shortly after. But there we all were, staring at the wavy air rising from our radiators, clutching blankets, speaking in whispers, and drinking hot broth with shuddering hands. Not shuddering from the cold, yet. New London was going to survive. Everyone knew that. The faltering voice in the street said as much. New London was alive. And then the storm came. The last few cutters raced back down to us, veering about as the storm's frontier arrived. I sounded the alert across the city. The tether on the beacon was wound in, the storehouses were sealed and guards posted. The world was gone now. But if everyone followed my plan, we'd be alive to see it again. Just perhaps not much longer after that. We had one major weapon against the storm, our crater. The gales on the edge of the maelstrom didn't collapse down upon us, but merely glanced above our heads. This sucked air upwards to join the fray, and led to these bursts, these squalls of dead wind dropping down to equalize the pressure. So Six said. To the ordinary man, it merely felt chilly. Chilly was the word indeed. It was -90, but felt warmer if you stood over the steam pipes that lined the streets. Those things could and did fry eggs, but such laxity was no longer permitted. Everyone had their rations, they had their homes reinforced, their fuel stowed, and their fears in check. No one really knew what would happen as the storm intensified, but there was nothing we could do now, so best settle in. All we needed to do was avoid being stupid. Best way to survive was to be calm and stick to the plan. The mates were good at that. They were still digging pits for our spare coal on that first day of the storm, and a few people braved the chills to help them out. It wasn't so different to the day before. In fact, the city was far more alive than usual, on account of our hunters and scouts, numbering some 200 by that point, being freed of the constant cycle of expedition and sleep. Everyone was milling about the streets, was warmer beside the heat tower than in the pub. That night's fights took place in the city centre, then. Two bloody fools took to the iron rods when things got ugly. Someone reported it to me. I had outlawed duels during the emergency period. Got there to find a Dummer and a Yank on the ground, both missing teeth. Dummer died in the infirmary, and people told me locking the kids up in a box was unnecessary. Cleared the streets. It was time to grab a few hours rest while our newest thermometers bottomed out at -100, a wonderful milestone. In the morning there was a rumbling feeling, followed shortly by the news that the tunnels our mates had dug down into the coal veins were collapsing. Timbers had been made brittle as the cold crept down into the earth, and the water pumps on the rock faces had jammed up. Groundwater turned to ice, expanded and shattered the tunnel walls. In other words, to get to the coal, we'd have to constantly replace the timbers and pump the water by hand, human hand. I had volunteers for it. I locked them up in their houses. Told them already, nothing stupid, didn't I? From then on, only people allowed out were the workers, with a guard shadowing each. I was done protecting them from God, now had to save them from themselves. Save New London. The only problem was the voice of New London was silenced. The hall couldn't take -100. Hot broth was brown ice in minutes. The streets were quiet then. No more work orders and no more information. The most dangerous possible arrangement. Concern about the fuel had everyone on the edge of panic already, and without a voice telling them the numbers again and again, hour after hour, they began to invent their own. I moved back in with 6. He'd got his lab still pretty balmy on account of a solid foot of books, papers and old hardened wood mulch lining the walls. Clever chap, but it's hard to explain, but as I lay there on that second night, surrounded by bits of my own speeches sticking out of the walls at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth of New London, my custom pristine truth, was twisting, corrupting, and now coming to envelop me. A strange thought, but as I've said, that is what the dark and noise of the storm does to your mind. It was hard to sleep. 6 didn't sleep. He was up all night trying to modify a thermometer's lower boundary down. He succeeded, as he always has done, and happily informed me the next morning that it was now averaging -110 around the city. Could see my breath now. For those out in the houses, things were getting bad. Days of cold had sucked the use out of the walls. The wood was going the way of the mine timbers, with crystals gradually sprouting out through splinters on the interior side. A few of them had dragged their radiators together and strung up sheets to trap the air around them. They were back in tents again, but it worked, and the guards spread the idea as they did their inspection. Inspection reached the coal stores and found a broken lock and missing stock. The fools weren't done testing me. House-to-house search found nothing but a bunch of shivering New Londoners. Who knows, it was probably the guards who stole the stuff in the first place. Not all of them were especially bright. In fact, the search itself proved it, since half the time they opened the front door to get into the houses, and the burst of freezing air that let in would take hours of misery to rectify. Told 6 to close the heat tower vents for a few hours to help out, but no longer. We had to save our emergency measures for the real trouble, which was yet to come. I should explain that our analysis of Nansen's research informed us that it really was going to be darkest before the dawn. The movement of the storm, its size, density and internal dynamics had all created a strange effect where the winds that trailed it were trapped there in the rear. They had been the longest without seeing sunlight, and so while not the fastest, they were the coldest. Had that to look forward to. At least that bloody search revealed that a good portion of the population had hypothermia already. I present that as a positive, for they'd have died if we didn't drag them out, kicking and screaming, to the infirmary. No one wanted to be away from their safe place, even if they were dying there. Huddled in their mass like those I left on the Atrabates. Not this time. In New London, anyone was mine to command, and I commanded that they live. They were determined to work against me though. With people from all the different houses clustered in the infirmaries for a while, they started sharing stories, and stories is all they were. Talk of how the storm would get worse, of how the generator was running dry, of how I was tearing the dying away from their families in their final moments. Doesn't matter how true it was, their stories were poison. The people, ready for anything just days ago, had been pressed, squeezed down to their knees by the storm. The endless rattling, where every snap could be the last thing you hear, where every second away from the radiator was agony. Nobody was sane. Nobody was safe. And they knew it was getting worse. And they knew that the tower vents could be closed. Things were starting to fall into place. Another Kamasi. The people had become desperate and forgot who they were, who I was. They knew there was relief to the pain. They knew it would make the plan fail. They knew both truths and focused only on the best one, as I had taught them. In Africa, it had been the banditry of the nationalists and the allure of weapons to take revenge. Here it was the injustice of being one who died to keep the city alive, and the allure of killing everyone so that you might die in comfort. And this time, no Connaught to come along and shoot the guilty and innocent alike into oblivion. I had to do that for myself. If only 3 people survived this time, it would be very nearly my fault. Would have been my fault entirely, if the rebels hadn't struck first. It was the morning of the 42nd day, the centre of the storm, but not yet the worst of it. Our guards braved minus 120 degrees to walk the streets and ask after people's health at each door. And how did they repay them? With lies. They said they were fine. Damned fools didn't care if it was too cold for the ill to stay. They wanted them to stay for the bloody company. This wasn't Kamasi. It was the people who were the killers, not the troops. I told the guards to enact martial law. We had to survive 2 more days at least. Too cold to eat, too cold to drink half the time. But it wasn't too cold to listen to bloody orders and keep New London alive. I would force them to survive. And they would force me to kill them, one way or another. Guards were attacked as they broke open doors. Inside, the houses were already battlegrounds between true New Londoners and the rebels. The action stirred up a push for the heat tower. Rebels burst from houses and the infirmaries and rushed to gather beneath it, at least 100 of them. They locked the vents closed and faced off against the gathering ring of guards encircling them. I was above, looking out of a gap in the lab window that I carved through the plaster of wood mulch. In the houses exposed to the outside air, there wasn't much point sitting around the radiator until everyone was back in and the door closed for good, so the more peaceful residents piled out into the streets, mostly joining with our guards. The rebels called for me to come answer to them. Told Chalk to maintain the perimeter, pulled on a second coat and traipsed out. The siege parted and I stood before the crowd. Everyone was shouting, but you couldn't hear it over the wind. I had a megaphone brought up and a wire ran back to the lab to power it. Then I explained that the heat tower was liable to explode if the rebels didn't stand down at once. I handed it off to Six to explain it too. The Hero of New London medal amplified his words. Our side of the crowd was alive with support. They were as scared, sad, and hopeless as anyone else, but they knew I was right. They were calling out for the rebels to see reason, and sometimes trying to drag them away, but they were battered back. They were begging me to do something. What? You know what. New London gave us no choice. Ole and Chalk closed in on the tower. They had a squad of guards each, with rifles, some with bayonets. This was the Saber's Edge. This was the final chance for sanity. As if it had a chance, with the hollow moan of Earth itself being destroyed echoing from the heavens. I sound pessimistic, and in truth, plenty of rebels broke ranks and fled. Ordered they be let through, but some of the crowd started chasing them. A dedicated group remained glued to the heat tower's scaffold though, screaming obscenities, traitorous things not worth repeating, and clearly caring for nothing but the lives I had let them keep. Die with dignity was their principal demand. But this was martial law, and to accept death was long since outlawed. Tried to take them to the prison, But when the guards got close, the rebels lost their composure and attacked with everything they had, which was not very much at all. They threw themselves at us, at the bayonets. Blades could barely get through all the layers of coats and furs, but they did. In their final acts, they broke another law. They failed to die when I said they could die. The drawn blood was like spices in the pot. The crowd was enraged at the depth of the rebels' treachery. The energy possessed my guards and they stopped listening to me. I think, in retrospect, they might have tuned in to the voice of God instead, for now they declared their unerring righteousness and promised to save the city by cleansing it of doubters, plotters, and liars. It was a mob unrivaled since the age of witches. Or, I'll say nothing else of it. The doors that had remained closed were opened, and everybody was uprooted. As crowds dashed about, I sent as many as I could to the labs to hide. One by one, I grabbed the guardsmen out of the houses and ended the rifle point interrogations. Most of them listened to me right away, and the rest acquiesced after seeing the pistol snugly fit in my glove. I planned to round them all up for a roll call of the militia, but long before I found them all, I was called to the main infirmary. 3 guards ran past me in the other direction as I approached. Inside, Painsworth was lain up on a hospital bed with a doctor on either side of her. Their boots slipped about in the blood dripping down from the bed frame. Witnesses told me Painsworth had been accused of complicity with the conspirators, given that they had planned these things under her nose. Only evidence I had against it was that Painsworth had more than half a brain. The finest asset a human can possess, yet a moron can take it away from you without thought. With the troops in my entourage, I returned to the search. People were starting to seal their doors again and settle down, but at the other end of the city there was a crowd around the grounded beacon. Found out what they were doing before I got there. The beacon began to rise, beneath it hanging a dull brown wreath, a wreath of rebels. I ordered everyone with a rifle to open fire. Precious seconds passed while they puzzled over this order, then upon repetition they obeyed. A continuous thunder of shots poured in the general direction of the beacon. The balloon was 3 inches of rubbery membrane. Bullets probably bounced off it, since it kept rising up without so much as a tremor. But we kept firing, with my orders being to lower our sights. I took a rifle myself, centered the iron dimples on the hanging wreath, and emptied the magazine. Maybe at least one rebel got their wish, and left this world before the storm snatched them all away, snapped the beacon tether and whisked them off to die in terror. They were gone by the time I had reloaded. I think many people in the crowd had supposed the beacon could be returned, their captives suitably punished by a stint in the maelstrom. They were quiet when I rushed up, although perhaps they had heard the vast amount of gunfire and supposed I was more villain than they. The guns were levelled and everyone was ordered home. No questions were asked. A few had already gotten frostbite from being outside all morning. What could they say? Painsworth had it worse. After all that, the heat tower safety vents were opened to let off some steam. Problem was that the reduction in steam temperature this caused allowed the last small digits of heat to trickle away in the houses. The water pipe started freezing, so after a few hours I was forced to turn the safety off again. We had to make it 2 more days, but the heat tower would crack before then, 6 was insisting. What were we to do? Easy. Listen to the voice of New London when it came to your door, and otherwise do absolutely nothing. Radiators get hot, then sit by them. Radiators get cold, then there's a reason, so just wait like everyone else. It was extremely simple, and after the sobering 40-second day, people finally got it. A few boys dragged the bodies near the heat tower into the snow, then hurried back inside. 21 confirmed dead, 6 more missing, plenty more injured. At least ice for the bruises was easy to come by. Ran the generator without the safety for most of the night, and so we survived, with only 100 or so new cases of hypothermia and the occasional beginnings of frostbite. Infirmaries and even the emergency medical tents were full, 1 in every bed, 1 on the floor beside every bed, and it was only going to get worse. The maelstrom was thinning, and the daylight was more noticeable than the days prior, but the heat tower was groaning, shuddering, and even deforming under the pressure. I had to open the valves, and when I did, the chimneys at the top almost exploded. 6 begged me to leave them open until tomorrow, when the worst of the worst was due. For New London then, the radiators went cold. This is a figure of speech, for they were still far too hot to touch, but when the air is -120 and the wind is racing, it has to be on the verge of melting to reach you just a foot away. With the medics overloaded and Painsworth the colour of the sky, it seemed like death finally had us in its grasp. I was shivering there, alone in the lab. 6 and the rest of the engineers had retreated to their homes. Lab was warmer, but the darkness had taken them all. They had people they wished to die with. It was against the law, but as I've said, I allowed weakness to be earned. They'd got us this far, but it wasn't enough, they despaired. Fools. They had forgotten that New London cannot die. I went around and told them as much again and again. When I ordered them back out into the street, they did as I said. What other proof do you need? I needed those fellows to play the city's trump card. Just as we escaped death in the city by draining the Frostlands of life, now we could escape death in our dark huddles by sacrificing the life the city had borne, the mates. More precisely, we could use their steam core drives to heat water and illuminate spaces for new infirmaries. Crammed people from various houses together so we could demolish a few, then built new wards in their place. Well, the mates did all this. In essence, we just watched them deconstruct each other on command, then the survivors used the body parts to give us sanctuary. They were the finest New Londoners of them all, and deserved every salute they got as they knelt down, let out a blast on their horns, and awaited their end. Ran the generator hot to try and get the new places usable. As we did, there was a sound from the crater's edge. It sounded like an explosion. Guards reported that when they arrived to investigate, a lockbox had bashed its way down the glacier and clanked onto the lift. Inside was a barely legible message asking for the lift to be raised. It was an out-of-the-question impossibility that someone could be there, but I ordered the lift up. Took almost an hour, its gears stuffed with ash and its steam core being robbed of heat, but it got up there. Waited a few minutes, then brought it back down. Couldn't actually see it when it was at the very top, and we only knew it hadn't been blown away by virtue of the rapidly oscillating chains that ran down below it. We had to go inside to wait out the thing's descent. When it reached us, there was a man with a heavily laden sled standing on it. He wasn't standing for long. We rushed out and dragged him and the sled into a medical tent. It was the man I had sent out to look for his daughter. The daughter was stowed deep in the cargo on the sled. Had mining charges in there too, from Winterhome. Assessment was that they would live, albeit without a few of those blackened limbs. A bloody miracle. We'd need another Hero of New London medal. Evening was coming, and the temperature was dropping. The merciless rearguard of the storm was at our gates. The generator was still complaining loudly, but we had no choice but to close all the vents to have any hope of keeping the infirmaries mild enough for life. The houses, where most people were huddled, were a lost cause. There was a sense of doom, an order of magnitude more compelling than that of the previous month, or even the previous week. New London was now each house, each huddle. We wished each other good luck on a final round of inspections that evening. The crowds in the infirmaries were quiet, their soldier stares masked by anything and everything they could wrap around themselves. The walls around them rattled and cracked, the pipes rang and clanked, the lamps swung and flickered. The ice crawled along beams and up the bedposts before their eyes. I have no idea how cold it was, but it was a damn sight colder than 120 that night. We had to lock off most of the steam pipes so that what little could reach the infirmaries wasn't already just cold water. Didn't make much difference for most houses anyway. Plumbing had all burst as ice grew inside the pipes. The last moments of the Atrabates crew were playing out in every home across New London. I was on the scaffold of the heat tower with Six and a few of his protégés. You know what? It was pretty damn hot. The generator had all moderating factors slashed away and was burning hotter than ever before. Flakes of snow turned to steam as they hit the sides, then immediately back to snow just a few feet away. The whole thing was swaying more and more, to the point where we all felt compelled to hang on to the railings. Six was screaming at me again and again that it was liable to explode at any minute. The inner workings of the tower were visibly glowing red hot. If anything melted, it was over. I finally gave in when the whole thing whined like a dying horse. The valve levers snapped open by themselves as soon as the locks on them were released, and the entire tower was dug an inch deeper into the ground by the rocket of yellowish steam that pierced the sky, with us foolish humans clasping onto the railings with no justification for being alive so close to that power. It died down, and we could open our eyes. The lights on the outside of the infirmaries fizzled out as their steam cores were parched, then flooded. Those inside heard the screams of the heat tower and knew at once why New London had done this to them. I scaled down a ladder to the ground and picked up the brittle megaphone. This was it, I supposed. I cried out, with my breath turning to ice and scattering like dust in front of me, for everyone to gather at the heat tower. It was coming up to 6 o'clock after all, morning briefing time. New London obeyed. Wretched things emerged from the houses and hospitals. People dragged themselves and others over to lie in the broken earth around the tower. It was so cold that 2 minutes in the street was enough to claim a hand or foot. When the able went to help the slow frostbitten, they were bitten themselves. After 10 minutes, we had the whole city piled in a heap before me, everyone shaking uncontrollably, so much that they couldn't even moan at the pain as their flesh died, cell by cell. Flecks of molten metal fell from the heat tower, but cooled before they landed on the dying below. We made some effort to get people up onto the scaffold where it was warmer, but only a score were fit enough for the ascent. That was it then. The mates had been immobilized and just swayed back and forth here and there around the city. Had enough coal loaded in the tower for another hour of heat. Just had to stand there, look down to see if any wisps of breath were still coursing around down in the pile of humanity, and look up at the relentless sky. I had 8 bullets in my pistol, but not the dexterity to fire it. The will, though, I had that. I was willing to let God win. He was right. We were over, and misery was all that remained if we disobeyed him. I couldn't give New London an easy death. I was forcing them down the worst road to the end I could find. Half dead, half alive, and getting the worst of both. I was constantly awoken from my stupor of despair by the knowledge that everyone else was in a worse state and was still following my order, still staying alive. I was probably the only one who really saw all the details of what happened in the sky around 7:30 on the morning of the 44th day. The Maelstrom's rear edge approached quite suddenly, at a sprinting pace, faster than the rest of the storm. The wind died away over perhaps 10 minutes. It is better to say it was pushed away. The high-pressure air, prophesied to be trailing the storm, had arrived. It was attacking the storm, shrinking it faster than it could escape. The air cleared. The sun was already above the crater lip in the east, blinding us with light that was once called faint. The warm air from above came down on us like the merciful breath of Satan. It fell fast, and it almost burned us. We didn't know then, but later we figured we'd had 100-degree improvement or more in just a few minutes, which was a change so rapid that it stung like acid on your skin and drove people to crawl out into the frozen ash beside the street. Some of them jumped away as the steam pipes hidden underneath fizzled back to life. The glow of the heat tower was fading, and the pumps were still operational. Lights snapped back on around the city as the steam cores were refilled. The mates let their horns sound, and those with any life left in them stumbled onto the compressors to drink. I was standing absolutely still, clinging onto the railing, looking around as moaning turned to a kind of laughter, and weak limbs gestured at the sky. I kept looking up and down, up and down. I was right. I was right then, I had been right before. I was right all along. Someone got their hands on my megaphone down there and screamed it. We are alive. It was barely true, but it was no story either. I hurriedly got everyone down from the tower scaffold. We turned the pressure down to ease it back into normal operation, and I had Hodge, who was one of the dozen or so people without injury, go out and get the mate to bring us more coal. It was all happening too fast. I pulled down the rags across my face. The air was still well below zero, didn't need a thermometer to tell that, but it was back in the realm of earthly temperatures, like how it had been while we were walking to New London in the first place. It got warmer as the sunshine went on and midday approached. By then, we had completed the very slow process of getting the immobile to the infirmaries and everyone else to the makeshift hospitals in the mess hall and the houses closest to the tower. Had about 600 cases of frostbite to deal with, and no doctors. Almost the whole city needed a heat bath and constant regulation of the temperature to avoid making it worse. Luckily enough, those sacrifices we made earlier allowed the mates to handle it for everyone en masse. Making amputations, that was another matter entirely, eventually worked through by taking an approach of triage so that the doctors were on their feet first. They told me I was suffering from hypothermia while I was helping out. So what? I was alive. The city was alive. The god-forsaken remnants of civilization, of a species that we were, was alive. The storm made its merry way off, and the desert air moved on in. Proof that belief in my prophecies was worth much more than belief in the perpetrator of all this. That night, we slept in 20 degrees. Heaven on earth. Or merely New London. Not everyone made it through the next couple of days. They were released from New London's service. They were happy to have seen the city return to life. Chalk finally lived up to his name, the bugger. Most people were back on their feet by then, though. The frost had not set in for long enough to be beyond removal, and we had people out walking the frostlands after the lift was repaired. There wasn't much out there. Winterhome remained a mark on the landscape, with all remaining buildings collapsed and covered in snowdrifts. Found some dead animals to bring back for our cooks. Tesla City's walls were mostly still standing, but the force field tower was lying on its side, the buildings it crushed as it fell having been cleaned away by the wind. The nearby hot springs had nearly thawed the ice that covered them by the time we got there, and there was still movement in the water below. By rationing our stored supplies and doing what we could to find more out there, we had a few weeks of breathing room. We continued to live, and but for the murderers who needed to return to London, we were all fine. New London got its voice back, and everyone listened. Those old doubts about whether we deserved to live were gone. Life was the gift I had given them here, and I gave it to none who did not deserve it. It was around then that our boffins schemed up the creation of the glasshouses. We used the space cleared from empty houses and storage pits to create these boiling hot enclosures heated by steam and the magnification of the summer sun. As you must have seen, we could use them to finally grow potato plants with fertilizer from Winterhome. Mates took great care looking after them. Had to hang on until the onset of winter before they were ready, but our hunters found what we needed, and our growing outpost at the hot springs kept us off the New London special. We saw -40, -50 that winter, but what was that to us? We drove on through in good order, no incidents of theft, no panic, just carrying on for New London. Then, that spring came, that real spring, courtesy of the storm. Broke zero. Had to enjoy that, since it's only going to get colder as the years go by. Well, now you probably want to know where we went if you're reading this. If you ever walked the west coast and puzzled about this Hephaestus I mentioned, Then here's your answer. We took it south. New London is capable of withstanding many more winters, but you must admit, it is a little on the chilly side. We spent the summer of '87 getting the old American dreadnought back in order. Only part of the hull was of any use really, so it was a hell of a lot of work, but digging out Tesla City let us make a dozen more mates to sort it out. It's September 2nd as I write this, just over a year since the storm. Sea will ice up again soon, so we're going to take our leave of this latitude and see what spring is like in Bordeaux these days. With any luck, the mates will go back to London after they push us out. They'll have strict orders to go home, just as we do. That's right, Lord Gloucester had given me orders to return to England as soon as possible, back in the airship over Edgware. We'll get close. Was enough of a bugger to grow crops outside in Blighty even before the Great Frost. I don't know what to expect down there, to be frank. We've all speculated on whether other groups survived. It seems impossible that no one else is out there. But if you take the discussion further than the pub, you can suppose that while there's a scant chance people survive the cold and the storm, you have to factor in the chance that they didn't go the way of Winterhome, or Tesla City, or bloody London. What's the chance of a group surviving all those tests? I bothered to write this, so clearly there's a wide-eyed child in me yet. There's something else in there too. Some hope I don't dare embrace. We won't know until we get to Rem. Six says the stuff we need is there, but there's a chance we aren't all going to die, regardless of what happens. And if there's a chance, well, we're alive, and there was only the slimmest chance of that. If you've read through the notes from the Royal Society on the sun dimming, you might be interested in a new theory. A couple of the nannies had these calculations to show that the Yellowstone blast might have thrown pieces of the Earth away into the cosmos. Very small pieces, but lots of them. A form of big mega dust. This created a wave, a screen of the stuff that is slowly but surely making its way out into the unknown. What we've come to believe is that this dust is the true cause of the observation of solar dimming. By virtue of its position relative to our orbit, it makes spring and summer cold but doesn't do much to winter, which fits with what we've experienced, wouldn't you agree? The dust should, they say, disperse gradually as it travels. In other words, the dimming will reverse, although we can't say when without finding intact instruments, and without this theory holding any water whatsoever, of course. But you must have learned the value of a scant thread of truth in a tapestry of happy illusions, so I'm sure you'll forgive me wasting your time with this. New London is yours now then, whoever you are. You're the new captain. I wouldn't recommend the job, but it must be done. We'll be in the Riviera by the time anyone finds this, most likely. Or I suppose it could even be a great many years. There is every chance that we all died unceremoniously. Perhaps you already know. But you also know, I hope, that if I failed doing everything I needed to do. And I hope also that you see, in retrospect, all I've ever done in New London is to keep us on the one narrow path that brought us to this victorious voyage home. You'll think whatever you like, no doubt. Just giving you the truth, if you want it. If you're going to be spending time in New London, you'd best listen to its words. Whoever you are, I have two pieces of advice for you. First, don't go digging too deep in the lot across the way from the beacon. Second, if you ever have the interest, why don't you find an old map and look up where London used to be? With any luck, there'll be something new there waiting for you, weather permitting. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of The Last of the Lamplight. It was good fun to write, despite being quite a sad tale. Decided to give it something of a happy ending, but then again, this is a story with a dishonest narrator, you could say, so it's hard to say how things really went down in the pure canon. Special thanks to everyone who donates on Patreon to make projects like this one possible, you can join their illustrious ranks via the link in the description, etc. You know the drill. So that's all from me. I'll see you in another video, and in the meantime, stay warm out there, folks.